Hello, everyone. Settlers Lament here. Uh, and today I'm joined by Charlemagne and The21stReaction. The21stReaction is just a Discord friend of mine. He's started a new channel, which you should all subscribe to. Link in the description. And yeah. So today we're going to be talking about libertarianism and post-libertarianism. That is like, the problems with libertarianism. Why is it that it seems like it's that so many people have realized that's such a flawed ideology? And like what lies beyond libertarianism after you sort of experience the problems that a lot of people have had with it. And these issues aren't anything new. I do think that there's been a lot more libertarians over the past, 5 or so years waking up to these issues. But these people identifying these issues have gone back for a decade or two now, at least. So that's the basic structure of the stream. Anything either of you guys would like to say?
I've definitely noticed a very significant neo-reactionary direction among the libertarians or Austrians I hang out with online. They're becoming a lot more red-pilled and reactionary over the years while still maintaining their Austrian roots, which I think is a good thing.
Yeah, the paleo-libertarians are basically the perfect people to on-ramp to neo-reaction because although they're a dying breed, they accept some of our they would be sympathetic to some of our interests and our beliefs. The idea of ordered liberty, and not just liberty itself, freedom itself, but ordered liberty, desire for borders and structure and that stuff.
So I think an interesting place to start out is if any of us have any reflections on the McAfee, and I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, interview that me and Charlemagne did last week. Because he certainly is not a post-libertarian or anything like that. And I don't want to be mean to him. I very much appreciate that he was willing to do an interview with us. And I think it was fun. But I do think he also symbolized a lot of the problems that we have with libertarianism.
I didn't watch the stream, but I did hear from a Jesse Lee Peterson clip that he's like a chain smoker and he drinks a lot.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And he talks about that stuff and like plays into it a lot. He did talk about at the end actually. He had some like wholesome advice, but it clearly contradicts how he often presents himself.
Yeah, it was pretty interesting. I mean, it's clear that McAfee is very intelligent, but not entirely logically consistent in some of the things he said. Not that anyone is going to be right, but I think he placed maybe too much hope in the idea of sort of the masses throwing off the power structure. I mean, the two examples he used in the stream, actually, the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, they weren't exactly the masses throwing off the power structure so much as a new set of elites using the masses to just slide themselves in place. Not to mention, it's not like either of those two revolutions were particularly good for the common man. So those were strange examples to pick. I also think he had a strange conception of power, essentially equating power to bad. That you couldn't really do good with power, although implying that if the power basically went back to the people, like that would be good. So that seemed kind of contradictory. And I think he places too much hope in some sort of mass throwing off of the chains that are suppressing and oppressing us right now from the elites. I don't really think that sort of regime change is in order so much as a rotation of elites. And I don't think that simply deconstructing or destroying the existing power structure is going to automatically produce some sort of better, more good order. I think you really need this power structure in place to enforce your order, and I think this ties into post-libertarianism. To me, I don't even like to think in terms of libertarianism. I was never a libertarian myself, but I usually just think of Austrian economics myself. And I think if you want to have the most effective economic system, it is the Austrian system. But if you want to have a well-ordered society, that needs to be embedded in some greater structure that's going to maintain certain social orders around that Austrian system in order to prevent certain things from happening, like we see now with the pushing of all of this, I mean, every single agenda, right? The racial ones, the sexual ones, all of it. That stuff needs to be locked out by some power structure. And so the problem with libertarianism as a wholesale philosophy is you can't simply rely on the organic relations between people or the free relations between people to produce bottom up this entire structure. It needs to be put in place by some elites, and you cannot rely on the masses to do this. And I think the response by the general populace to the coronavirus and these riots just sort of demonstrates the fundamental unreliability of the free trade and exchange and whatnot as like a fundamental system of government. You have to have a power structure in place, and that's where neo-reaction comes in. So to me, the neo-reactionary way of thinking is post-libertarian, not in the sense that it dispenses with libertarian economics, but to the contrary, that it maintains that view, but also appends to it a proper theory of power that can actually enforce this mode of being on a country.
Yeah, it's. I mean, to put it simply, I think my main takeaway is that economics is important, but it's not everything. Where the way of thinking that has been sort of enforced for at least the past few decades, in the United States especially, and in the rest of the world that always copies the United States, is that economics is everything. That economics is the central building block of like democracy and of the political spectrums. What's the first thing that determines if you're left or right? Your economic views. And that's just like stupid. That's not true. That's where we get like the stupid stuff, like saying that like the Nazis weren't right wing. And I mean, we all, of course, disavow the Nazis. That's not the point of this. But like they obviously, in a cultural political sense, were right wing. The people that voted for them were people that would have voted for other right wing parties prior to that. Yet they had economic policies that are generally associated with the left wing. And the reasonable takeaway from that is that it's not as cut and dry, and that economics is not the primary determiner of whether you're left or right. That there's larger things to do with identity and culture that help determine those phrases. But when you only view it through the economic left-right spectrum, then the spectrum doesn't even really make any sense to you. I mean, if we go back to the beginning of this, the French Revolution, economics had nothing to do with the left or right. It was on a spectrum of how much you supported maintaining elements of the old regime or how much you supported changing them. But yes, with McAfee and McAfee, I don't know, McAfee, that's it, I think. He did buy into a lot the flawed democratic way of viewing the flawed democratic way of viewing history, because as you said, these changes, they almost never happen as some sort of large populist uprising. They happen. These changes happen because there's some clique in society that's able to gain power, and they're able to overthrow the clique that ran society prior to that. But
I'm very interested by the fact that McAfee was very utopian and bright-eyed about the demos coming over and conquering the current order. And I think it points to one of these really serious problems that libertarians have. And, several of them acknowledge it, including Dave Smith, who talks about this sometimes. But the reality is they have no good political methodology. There is no clear path to minarchy or civil libertarianism or even anarchy, because the libertarians generally don't understand the forces that resist them. If McAfee is so taken by the idea of demos always winning, the problem is democracy itself puts a country on the path towards the absolute opposite of libertarianism. When when the politicians realize that they can appeal to the masses from plundering the public treasury, that's the end of libertarianism. So that's just one example. And then another problem is that, the status, or, we would say the progressives, have basically direct control of the minds of children from cradle to like late adolescence in education, in the narratives they feed them. How are they supposed to combat that? I mean, there's these fundamental problems that they're not paying attention to, so they always have to envision this vague, distant path towards their society.
Mm-hmm. And I've basically come to the conclusion that, and this isn't unique to me, obviously, but I don't think democracy and libertarianism are fundamentally compatible at all. You can't really be both at the same time, because democracy undermines libertarianism.
Yeah, I mean,
it basically it undermines basically any system that you put in place. Is sort of the problem with democracy.
Yeah, I mean, the democracy will. It seems like democracy will always lead to, how best to loot the existing wealth of the society. And if that is the narrative that that we tend towards, like which economic policies are the best, what are the chances you're ever going to vote in all the time the pure Austrian economic policies? I know. I mean, if Austrians were the ones that ran the entire cathedral, if they controlled all the universities and the media, maybe that would be possible. But anything short of that sort of ideological control, it just seems absurd that you could have. It just seems absurd that a democratic society would also be a libertarian society.
And like you said, economics isn't really the primary driver for human beings. It's a bit deeper than that, and people have figured this out, right, since at least 2008. In the 80s and 90s, we sort of had this massive golden age of America, where the great foe of the Soviet Union was defeated, and you could just celebrate our prosperity. But in the 2000s, people started looking elsewhere, mainly the progressives, while the conservatives so-called conservatives were not fighting the culture war, and the progressives began voting and politicking not on the basis of economics, but on the basis of these other values, these radical egalitarian things that really don't have that much to do with economics at the end of the day. Obviously, there's going to be economic redistribution to certain groups, but that's not really what they're doing, right? All the stuff we see now, it's not merely about money. It's about something deeper than that.
Yeah, I was, when I first got into politics from a relatively young age, I was quite obsessed with the economic issues, just because that's what all the talking heads talked about. And in like high school and college and stuff, I could argue why reducing taxes is really good. I could argue that relatively well, at least to the standards of being able to embarrass a high schooler, but which isn't incredibly high standards. But I could argue those sorts of basic points well. And say this is really we need to cut taxes, or whatever the sort of standard normie-con lines. But the issue that I never really realized until I got on Moldbug and that type of stuff. Actually, Moldbug is definitely the right person to cite, as he talks about in at the very beginning of the open letter. He says that explaining to the average progressive why progressivism is all wrong is like going to medieval Europe and explaining to some peasant why just the entire Catholic order of the entire world that they're used to is just all wrong. It's like, where do you start? How could you possibly just debate someone out of something that dominates their entire life? So when I would debate with progressives and I would talk about tax policy or even immigration policy or something like that, it was completely besides the point, because I thought we were having a debate on policy. But even if I could convince them, say minimum wage is counterproductive, which is something I think I could convince people of relatively easily. They might come away at the end of the conversation saying, okay, yeah, minimum wage is probably counterproductive for the things we're trying to achieve. But like that doesn't mean that they're even one step closer to voting for the Conservatives or voting for anyone else or supporting anyone else, because it's not about minimum wage or tax policy. At the end of the day, the right are still Satan to them, and it's like going to a medieval peasant and saying, oh, you should vote for Satan, he has some really good governing policies. Like, it doesn't matter how well you can explain how great those governing policies are, it's still Satan.
Right, exactly. And this is one of the reasons why neo-reaction is so interesting, because it attempts to solve this problem, because as long as you're debate, and I understand libertarianism is more than just an economic theory in some ways, like it has to do with fundamental values of aggression and whatnot, but when you're spending most of your time debating on these economic things, it doesn't matter. You could win all of the economic debates you want and never make any progress. But the only time you really need to argue these things is in a democracy, right? When you actually have to convince people to vote your way, ostensibly in order to get things done. But you'll simply never convince them on economics.
I think this shows a difference between the progressives and the libertarians, and I would include the boomercons in here. So the progressives have a religious belief in equality, and generally a trust and faith in the current reigning institutions. The boomercons don't have that religious belief, but at the same time, they do have some nostalgia and some general trust for the institutions that they grew up with. But the libertarians are a different story. They reject the mainstream narrative on the economic history. They are generally skeptical of the current institutions, including bureaucracies and maybe even the university system. So they're the ones that are most sympathetic to us, that could come down our lane, because we don't have to fight this giant wall of faith in institutions and these misappropriated religious beliefs in equality. That's why they're the ones that are the most convincible.
Moving on, got a super chat here. And I think it's an interesting question. It's on topic, so we can talk about this now. Paul Cornelius for $5 said, "Just got here. Thanks for the good work. Question: what would a libertarian version of the cathedral, media, academia, politics look like? Is it possible?" I don't know because, like I said, the cathedral generally, naturally, at least the way that we understand it, tends towards more and more state intervention. There's probably some degree of a limiting principle to it. I don't think it necessarily means pure Soviet Union, that the cathedral will necessarily lead to the government controlling absolutely everything directly. But just the nature of the incentives are for the cathedral to loot money from the public purse as directly as possible. So I could imagine a world in which somehow people that believe in Austrian economics took over the entirety of the media and the entirety of academia. But even then, I think, especially if you have a democratic governing structure, that it would tend towards more and more state involvement, maybe less, but I still think it would tend towards that, just because that's the incentives of a democratic society.
So Moldbug's been going
around. I have an answer to this.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Oh, sorry, my audio is getting a bit sketchy, but
yeah, no problem.
I think a cogent answer to this is that there's actually an interesting similarity between a progressive cathedral and a libertarian cathedral, in that Moldbug identifies that the progressive cathedral works in a kind of way of spontaneous coordination, almost like a Austrian market that we would think of. So the problem is that the spontaneous coordination works in a way so that it's like water pouring into a pothole. It pours into the shape of the pothole in a way that increases and confirms and invalidates their power. The problem with libertarians is that they never are able to consolidate their own coercive power with these institutions that they have. They're always breaking down. They're always trying to throw the coercive power ring into the volcano. So there's interesting similarities, but there's this fundamental problem that libertarians cannot coalesce and create these coercive institutions.
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of where Moldbug comes in, and he's been going around calling himself a neo-monarchist lately, as opposed to neo-cameralist, which I think is probably a label I would ascribe to myself as well. And I think this is the only way you could really get any sort of libertarian economic system in modernity is to just enforce it. You wouldn't need a cathedral in a system like that, because the only reason the cathedral exists is because, if you, as you described, you need this sort of hidden soft power mechanism to sort of secretly control everyone's thoughts and promulgate a religion. But if you have a CEO or a king or emperor, you don't have to do that. You just tell people, you're going to freely associate or not, and you're going to like it or else, basically. And there's no need to promulgate this complex network. So I think maybe a cathedral could be possible, but ideally you wouldn't need one in a libertarian society.
Yeah, that's probably true. I mean, this isn't even hypothetical. We know that non-democratic libertarian societies more or less exist today. They might not be pure minarchism, but Hong Kong, at least definitely Hong Kong before the Chinese took over, and still mostly to this day, at least maybe mostly until a year or two ago, and Singapore, both are pretty close to a sort of non-democratic libertarian state.
Yeah, Singapore is a good example because it's highly ordered, right? It's very pro-nomian, which is what we are on the reactionary side of things. And they have this capitalistic free market, but also if you litter, they'll throw you in jail, right? So you can't. They're not going to tolerate any disturbances to their well-ordered society, and this is really how any society should be run, within reason.
Yeah. So not totally sure where to go from there, to be honest. I guess we do have another super chat. So would the direction, okay, sorry. Andrew, I'm not going to pronounce that last name, for £5 says, so would a direction towards Hoppe, Eugenicos, towards Hoppe and then Moldbug be a way to red pill libertarians then? I don't know. I've never read any of Hoppe's stuff. I've heard him mentioned many times, of course, by Moldbug and other people. I suppose it depends on what type of libertarian you're dealing with. Libertarian is, of course, not a very useful term to begin with. I do think we generally understand what we mean when we say that here. We're more referring to the sort of right libertarians, who are very concerned with economic liberty and personal liberty. But you, of course, just in your daily life or daily political exchanges on the internet and stuff, will find many people of many different persuasions that call themselves libertarian, even outside the explicitly left-wing socialist libertarians like Vosh. You'll still find many people that they call themselves libertarian. They might vote for the Libertarian Party in the U.S. And I mean, even voting for the Libertarian Party is probably the first tip-off that they're not a real libertarian. But all they're obsessed with is weed and guns, and they're not actually an ideological Austrian or anything like that. So it sort of depends on what type of libertarian you're trying to red pill. And I think the easiest way to try and explain to them the issues with their ideology is what we were just talking about, how it's just completely unachievable in our current society, that there's just no way that the existing power structures would allow would allow for a libertarian to be that there's no way the existing power structures would allow for a libertarian government to come to be. And sort of explain to them the anarch stuff, and maybe try and get them to read the open letter or some of Moldbug's shorter stuff. I've never really read any of Hoppe's stuff, so I can't really vouch for that. Could be useful, but I think that's the best way to explain it to them. Just that there's no way they could achieve what they want to achieve with how power is currently allocated.
Well, I say
appeal to their principles. That would be my strategy. As Charlemagne was discussing earlier, I think NRX is the true expression, the logical conclusions of what an Austrian or what generally a right libertarian is searching for. So instead of arguing pragmatically, I would say that their conception of liberty can actually be translated into something more true. And as Endeavor and many people discuss this topic in one of his videos, the pre-modern conception of liberty, well, compared to the modern conception, which is freedom from constraint by other people in your actions. Well, the pre-modern conception of liberty was the state you reach when you attain full self-control over your passions and your desires. So what's necessary here is for them to understand that part of human nature is addiction, and often people will become enslaved by their vices. So really, if you want true freedom, maybe you should pursue the freedom to become, the freedom to self-actualize, the freedom to pursue virtue itself, instead of the freedom to get addicted and to play CSGO and do nothing about the culture wars for the rest of your life.
And I think sort of building on that, a lot of what libertarians are interested in is not so much freedom per se, but just anti-tyranny. They don't want tyranny, and tyranny is what we have now. And really, the only way to prevent tyranny is to hold power yourself. And this is a pretty common theme in literature, like the Lord of the Rings, which we reference a lot. I mean, after they defeat Sauron, they don't just all go back to their separate kingdoms and continue on the merry way. The humans reunite under a single king who's going to maintain that order that they built by overthrowing the dark power, which is exactly the situation we're in now. So I think if you appeal to that anti-tyranny aspect of how libertarians feel, that can go a long way in convincing them that that more proactive means need to be enacted in terms of holding and wielding power in order to prevent tyranny from taking place.
Yeah, to respond to some of what Reaction said, I think you're kind of wrong, to be honest. I mean, I agree with what you were saying about the libertarian concept of liberty to be morally and intellectually bankrupt, but I don't think it's necessarily very useful to just go to a libertarian and try and explain that to them. Because I mean, I've done that, and I haven't found it incredibly useful. And I never was a full libertarian, but I was the sort of standard conservatarian when I was younger. So I feel like I was 50% libertarian. But I back then when I did more or less buy into a lot of libertarian stuff.
I was full on ANCAP.
But when I did buy into a lot of that stuff, I didn't find those types of arguments very convinced. I did, come into contact with them a bit, not a massive amount. I haven't found libertarians find those arguments very convincing. I think disillusioning. I think disillusioning people with what they're trying to achieve, showing to them how what they're trying to achieve is not possible, is really effective. That's that helped me a lot when I was a boomer con / conservatarian / whatever. Is when I came to the conclusion that the very basic things I wanted, which was just like tax cuts, reduce immigration, get rid of abortion, the sort of really basic conservative stuff. Even those really basic things were completely unachievable, except for tax cuts, of course. Trump can always get those. But other than that, it just seemed like it was a completely impossible thing to achieve those very basic things. And once I became so disillusioned with the system, that's what made me think about interacting with different ideas. So that's why I think it's really important to try and undermine the effectiveness of what they're trying to achieve. And then I think that will very often open people's minds up to other things.
Yeah, I would say trying to appeal.
What are we going to do about their fundamental beliefs? Because their fundamental beliefs are sympathetic in some respects, and if you just shift them a bit farther towards us, then that might fix our problem.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, if you can convince them that would do all the work for you. I just I don't find it's very easy most of the time. I don't think it's very easy most of the time to change people's minds and those sorts of things. I think the easiest way to change people's fundamental beliefs is to explain to them that it's just not possible to achieve what they're trying to do. And then once they realize that, they'll explore different ideas and hopefully change those fundamental beliefs. I'm not totally sure, but that's just my.
I think the conservatarian type that you mentioned earlier is a lot more useful and easier to appeal to. I mean, first of all, there aren't really that many true libertarians. It's kind of a niche, very nerdy philosophy, or really, I mean, so and the people who do follow it seriously are going to be very into what they're doing. Whereas with right-wing Americans or conservative Americans generally, they tend to have more free market leanings, and they might even have, maybe someone like Steven Crowder, for example, would essentially be libertarian on economics, but they have this sort of greater set of values that's really driving things. And I think those type of people, maybe people who would just call themselves classical liberal, are much better to appeal to, A, because there's just more of them, and B, they're not so specifically into this certain economic philosophy as their fundamental driver. I mean, when I encountered Moldbug, I was basically at the, I would watch Steven Crowder and, still watch Sargon and stuff like that way back when, before I started reading the videos. And then I just read the open letter, and it just kind of blew my mind, right? And I think, Settler's Lament, it sounds like he was in a similar position where he was just sort of a conservatarian, not really ever was a libertarian, and it worked really well on him. And just from interacting with people, I find that the capitalist or libertarian-leaning conservatives are a lot more easy to bring along the way than the really hardcore libertarian types.
Well, I think, my experience going from, like voluntarist ANCAP was going with the initial kind of basic skepticism of the reigning institutions and just running with it and going a little farther and seeing how the whole thing topples over. So perhaps that might be a strategy over time, is they do have skepticism of the institutions that contradict them and that, blow out Keynesian theory, modern monetary theory, all the nonsense. They see that hole in the picture that we have now. So why not widen that hole so that the dam cracks and everything floods? That's basically what happened to me.
Yeah, and it's conversion is definitely possible. And I do think moving the libertarians along into more neo-reactionary ways of thinking is important, because the libertarians, I find, tend to be more high level or just elite in their thinking. They're very well read. They're very intelligent, a lot more than just your average conservative. So we don't necessarily want like a mass movement. And we do want to bring in these elite thinkers right now. And I know there's interesting things going on with libertarianism in the United States, actually, if you've been paying attention to it, sort of a backlash against the subversion of that party. Because one of the interesting things about the Libertarian Party in the U.S. is it's basically become the Libertine or Lawbert Party. It's been subverted by leftists, just like everything else in the United States. But there's actually an effort going on right now by more serious libertarians to take that party back away from the libertines and turn it into something that one would actually recognize as right-wing in some capacity. Because I think, and correctly so, people don't really view the Libertarian Party in the U.S. as a right-wing party because, well, it's not. It's just a libertine party, as you can see from some of those more infamous memes that have appeared from their conventions over the years.
Yeah, I can't remember. I think it was Hoppe. But I remember reading a quote once, which I think is relatively well known among like the post-libertarian crowd, talking about how libertarianism was doomed by the fact that it seems like it inherently attracts a very large quantity of people. At least when you use that term publicly, it attracts a lot of people for the worst reasons. And not talking about that sort of intellectual core that you're referring to, of people that read a bunch of books on Austrian economics. Those are relatively good quality people. But then it also, if you go to libertarian forums, attracts a huge amount of people that just want to be able to do the most degenerate things possible.
Yes.
They want to have as much drugs as they want. They want to be able to, like, just do whatever they want to be able to do whatever they want, and not for a principled reason. Which this is what an ideological libertarian would say, is that you should be able to do whatever you want on a principled reason, but there should be like social mechanisms to prevent you from doing a lot of those bad things. And that's all good in theory. But I hung around libertarian groups on the internet quite a bit, and a lot of these people were just gross people. That they didn't support liberty as some sort of abstract good. They supported it because they wanted to do really gross stuff. So that's one thing that really doomed like the Libertarian Party. And also another thing is that it's just become the default none of the above party. So you get a lot of Democrats that vote for it purely just because they get more votes than any other party, and it's just a way of saying I don't like the Democrats or Republicans.
Yeah, and I actually know people who are essentially leftists who would vote for the Libertarian Party for that reason. And
yeah,
I mean,
so do I. I have a friend who's a social democrat and Bernie supporter, and in 2016 he voted for the Libertarians just because he wasn't going to vote for the Democrats.
Mm-hmm. And of course, I don't. I think the Libertarian Party is a useful institution to try and, I guess, subvert or resubvert, if you want to put it that way, because one of the interesting things about libertarianism is that, over the last couple decades, they've actually established a fairly solid set of sustainable institutions, like the Mises Institute and such. And this is a problem we see on the right currently in terms of building institutions. They tend to get shattered by the cathedral very easily, or at least can't really seem to make any headway. Something like Patriotic Alternative, for example, in Britain. I don't have anything against PA, but obviously they're having a tough time getting anything going. But the libertarians have actually had solid, reputable institutions in existence for dozens of years at this point. And if that ground can be taken back, that can serve as a really useful alternative ground for the right wing to build its vision for the future of society, as opposed to trying to tackle the whole problem at once, because it's a lot easier to subvert these smaller but also well-established institutions than to try and face the universities directly.
Yeah, that is a good point. I think one of the big reasons they've been so successful is just there's a lot more of an emotional detachment with purely economic ideas. So like even just like very mainstream immigration talking points from just someone like Trump, something Trump would say in a campaign stop on immigration is something that could get you kicked out of university or something. But you can talk all day about how much you want to abolish income tax, and like people think you're stupid if they're lefty, or even if you're righty. Probably I'm not against getting rid of all taxes, but you could talk about abolishing the income tax or tax altogether, and like no one really cares because it's purely economic issues seem a lot more abstract. So I think that's one thing that's allowed these institutions to flourish, again, with a lot of massive funding too. But yes, does anyone else have anything to say on that?
I would just add that I think we actually kind of need to get rid of this word libertarian entirely, really. It's not really very useful, and it's been subverted by so many of these idiots. Just the term classical liberal is a lot more neutral, or I just prefer to talk in terms of Austrian economics if I'm talking about libertarian ideas. Just same with like socialist and capitalist. These are very loaded, subverted words, and it makes it very difficult to really actually have to convey your meaning to people effectively, because with the term libertarian, people have this idea, in their head of the dude weed bros and stuff like that, and that's absolutely not what it's about at all. Libertarian society ought to be a very ordered society, and not just this libertine mess. That's not what serious Austrians are going for.
Yeah, I remember something the academic agent, who's in the chat, by the way, said on a stream a while ago, like a month or two ago, that a lot of people have a perception that the libertarian society would be like flower power hippie stuff, but in reality, if you put all this stuff up to private corporations like policing, a private police force would probably be a lot more brutal and a lot more cold, because they're in it ultimately to make a profit, than the sort of restrictions that are put on police currently. So yeah, so it might be, so if we did actually get a libertarian society, it might be done through a libertarian framework. But there's a lot of things that would seem a lot more that would seem a lot more harsh than it exists currently.
Right. I mean, if you're an upstanding
there's
citizen,
also,
what are you
some
going to pay
interesting
for?
stuff about a libertarian society. Basically, although we often think about it only in terms of economics, and the libertarians do that too, they also have the reality that people would face the consequences of their actions economically, and that would bleed into the social sphere. So we all, right now, a giant single mother welfare state has serious just dysgenic effects on the population. But if you removed all those things, then suddenly people will have to be accountable for the actions that they have. So it would actually might indicate a reversion to more traditional norms, because those are the ones that would fall more in line with natural law and helping people survive more.
Yeah, and if you were in a society like this, there would be much more incentive to directly participate in the establishment of this order, because the responsibility is much more in your community's hands, as opposed to the current motherly state we have, where everything's just kind of taken care of for you. I think you could build a much more orderly, more pronomian, more right-wing society if it was more left to individual people and communities to build. Obviously, with still a powerful government overseeing this, but allowing people at the local level to put that order together themselves. And then, of course, some places would fail as well, but they would fail deservedly. I mean, places like Chaz, if you did leave this kind of thing up to localities, well, some places wouldn't be able to cut it, but they would be pushed out eventually, and a proper order would be established. I mean, just think about policing. You mentioned policing earlier. If you were paying for local security as opposed to a police force, which you pay through with taxes, are you going to pick the flimsy law enforcement officers like we have now, or are you going to pick some serious security force that's just going to deal with thieves harshly, right? And I have no problem with this. I'm not a thief. I'm not going to go into a store and steal something. So of course I would pay for the security force that's going to enforce order much more harshly, and that's just going to be better for everyone.
Yeah, I agree. So moving on, another super chat that we got from Rhett Rothberg says a lot of right libs only think in terms of economics and politics. It doesn't make the connection to culture. Not sure how to fix that. Does anyone have anything to say about that?
This is a problem
I
I
love
see
this
a
one.
lot. People are always trying to find economic solutions to cultural problems these days. So many people are just caught up in terms of a lot of normies, especially, are just caught up in terms of, okay, well, we just need universal basic income, or we just need to fix these equalities, or give certain people higher wages and stuff. But that's really not what the problem is. Like, you can't provide an economic solution to a cultural problem.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, even if it, I don't know if this is the best thing to say, but even if something like that was true, it still seems just morally suspicious. Like the problem with like murder isn't that it's a social problem; it's that it's evil. Like I don't know. The issue isn't that the issue isn't what tax rate will result in the most fine-tuned society. The issue is preventing blatantly immoral behavior. Not like it's not about like fine-tuning best possible health outcomes, or best possible, or minimum amount of murders or something like that. But Reaction, do you have anything to say to that question?
Yes, yes. Sorry, I'm just struggling a bit because the audio is coming in really weird from my end. But I love this question because this is the fundamental problem they have. Libertarians are great at analyzing hard power, which comes from the state, and economics when they contain it just the economic sphere. The problem is that this is part of a larger picture and a larger framework. So when you apply free markets to the idea of sexual relations, well, it doesn't really work. An oligarch could have a polygamous consensual contract with multiple women in exchange for resources and security, etc. Or people consensually transact for prostitution, but that has serious violations of their basic dignity and their own mental state and their own mental health. So the problem here is people have the
Uh-oh.
opportunity to affect that
You're
actually
cutting
affect
out.
other people. The problem is that they always have this assumption that we are atomized individuals and we are rational, etc. So it's just the perfect summary of the problem that libertarians have.
I agree. It I mean, the classic libertarian response is mind your own business. How does that affect you? That type of stuff. And that is the I think a lot of the things they say on economic issues are probably good and true. But the mind your own biz mentality is something that really needs to be broken out of them. And it's something that it's such an appealing mentality to have. It's a mentality that I did have for a while. But the it's appealing. It seems the mind your own biz mentality. It seems to make sense, and it's also completely illogical. Just when you realize, how does the collective mental and physical well-being of society not possibly affect you? The idea that we're just big brains and jars completely disconnected from what everyone else is doing is patently absurd, and it's really an issue of framing, I think, to a great degree.
Yeah, and there have to be limits on this stuff. I mean, it's a very American thing to want to be left to your own business and run your own affairs. But there are certain places where things just need to not be allowed. Like say some university has a statue in front of it. Like I think they're taking down a Theodore Roosevelt statue somewhere recently, and I think the state should just say, actually, no, you just can't do that. Sorry, we don't care if you if it's your community, you're not going to dismantle history because that's what you want. Just no, you have to maintain these certain values, and you can't tolerate subversion of the system, right? So all this Black Lives Matter nonsense that's going on, that sort of thing should just be shut down by the neo-monarch.
And there's the crux of it. Really, post-libertarianism is just post-liberalism. So the contradiction, the paradox in liberalism is that we are tolerant of all people, including Lenin the revolutionary and the Fabian socialists and the degenerates that want to subvert your society. Well, you have to do something about them. You have to go Hoppian mode on them. And really, that's basically the only solution. And in order to have that solution, you have to disband, you have to disjoin from the assumption of liberalism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we need to literally physically shut down these organizations. I don't think that would be necessary or even necessarily a good thing to do. But we would, in a healthy society, need to make sure these organizations are looked at as kooks and have no real power. There are many organizations today that's just some crazy people that they can have their little organization, they can organize if they want, but they're not going to be allowed anywhere close to any sort of lever of power, whether that's the media or the university system. It needs to be understood that these guys are just kooks, and that no part of the establishment will placate them in any way.
Right, and they have mechanisms like that right now for right-wing groups.
Yeah. But yeah, moving on, another super chat from Aristocratic Owl. What do you guys think about how we can take power away from the cathedral? I think we need to start first by challenging them in higher education.
Yes, but not directly. I think it's all about providing alternatives and not trying to directly enter the territory of the university, because that's probably the most difficult ground you could possibly go after. And like I said earlier with the Mises Institute and stuff like that, there's plenty of university alternatives already that you can build. I mean, there's plenty of free online courses and stuff, or even paid for courses that you can get from various places. And what we need to be doing is establishing, the next phase of society that we want things to fall into. Because from what I see, it looks like the cathedral system is going to collapse. We don't really have to bother ourselves with trying to attack it directly and trying to push it over. It's going to come apart, and we need to be ready with something new for people to fall back on, to put it in place once this collapse actually happens.
Yeah, I mean, I'd mostly agree. I think the contradictions and the problems of the current system are so severe that eventually it will just get it will just get so bad that there's no way it can possibly be maintained permanently. Now, how that will happen and when that will happen is a very big question. But I do think this question does get at a certain problem in the sort of conservative mindset that needs to be pushed back against. Challenging them in higher education is important because that's one of the biggest nodes of power that the left and the cathedral has. But the idea that I've seen many boomer cons say of you need to become a professor and you need to you need to be the based conservative professor, that's just completely counterproductive. Even assuming you could actually get a job at a mainstream university and not just get fired for having mainstream conservative views, not even anything radical. I would not be shocked if they're going to start firing people for just saying gay marriage is bad. I wouldn't be shocked if that already happened. So just for the most moderate, basic conservative views, you could very likely lose your job as a professor. But even if that didn't happen, even if they permitted a couple based right-wing professors, that's not at the end of the day going to do anything. They are simply not going to allow a position where the dominance of the left in these institutions is simply just outdone by more and more based people becoming professors. They might allow a couple of them in to prove that actually they're not biased, and actually, we do have 1 out of 100 professors are conservative. But they're never going to actually allow their dominance of these institutions to be challenged.
Yeah, and something like the anti-versity, as Moldbug kind of cringily put it, already exists in some sense. I mean, there are plenty of jobs that will respect you having certain certifications on your resume that have nothing to do with the university. So it's not like this concept is entirely new. I mean, there are plenty of people doing it. We're just we want to expand this concept of alternative certification, completely legitimate certification that doesn't come from some accredited university. And I think the wind is with us in this direction, in that, there are just too many people going through universities now, and the value of a degree is decreasing. And so I think people are going to be looking for reliable alternative ways of knowing whether or not someone is certified in some subject or other.
Do you have a reaction?
Well, I was about to add that we can add the liberal arts aren't something that's extremely scary. It's not a high barrier to entry in the same way that medicine or law or engineering or those other tasks are. So what we can do ourselves is look into each topic. For example, I have a strong grasp of history, especially the general narratives and stories that they tell in the public school system. So what you can do is you can put each of those historical events that we usually put doubt on, you can put that in a coherent timeline and give the alternative story that people really need, because people are filled with gunk. It's not that people are unfamiliar or uneducated. It's that they're educated with many stories that just don't make sense. So if you go into a series, something like the Constitution, which is what I'm working on right now, you can create a long-term story and go through the primary sources and really explain it from our perspective. And I think that might be effective for the elite few people that we want, the highly intelligent people that we want to start understanding and adopting our ideas.
Yeah, and I think anyone doing this in the medium term, it's of interest to affiliate with each other to sort of mutually reinforce credibility. I know there's organizations that do courses like this outside of university, but I'm blanking on the names. But if organization A is known to be legitimate and it says, hey, we approve of organization B and C, and they do this for each other, you can sort of mutually reinforce this decentralized network to add to the credibility and not try to go at this completely independently. So that's something we need to be looking at as well. And this is one of the useful purposes certain libertarian institutes can serve, because they, like I said, they have credibility. And get a GF.
That comment seems kind of random, but I had to pin it.
It's not. It's the answer to the libertarian question.
That's probably true.
No joke.
But yes. Moving on, another good super chat from Top Dog Man for $5 said, I think we really need artists in this community to help promote NRX ideas that go beyond just funny memes. As of now, it's stuck in the autist sphere. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that.
Watch my Sorry, I was just gonna say watch my Culture Wars video. It contrasts the modern culture with some of the archaic stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree with the comment that we need to have art. I mean, my main issue with that is I'm not an artist at all. I mean, I've written a few short stories a few times and a few songs, I guess. Nothing interesting, nothing worth publishing, really. And I certainly cannot do any sort of visual art. So it's not something that I can really personally do. But if there are any artists out there producing interesting stuff, or who would like to produce interesting stuff, I'd be interested in talking with you, or whatever. Maybe help promote your stuff if you're trying to do anything interesting like that. But I do think it could be important and helpful if we could have short films on YouTube or something like that push interesting messages that aren't like explicitly political. It's not like the cringe God's not dead thing where the entire message is obvious, but things that just kind of that have interesting messages within them will still be an interesting work of fiction, or more, or art that accomplishes similar things.
Yeah, and art can never really be political. It has to come from an emotional or cultural or spiritual space. So people who are really into the ideas and aren't artists themselves are just totally incapable of making it. Unless they're struck by some inspiration. But I think often too, certain things maybe can be appropriated. Like I know Morgoth did this video a while back on this Warhammer 40K story called Hell's Reach that someone did a really interesting 3-hour animation of, and that basically has, I mean, that is a reactionary work of art itself. So it's not even the case that someone has to be explicitly reactionary in order to make reactionary art. I mean, and even if you just pick apart stuff that comes from, even Hollywood, you can find certain bits of these ideas in it. So it might be the case of just finding, of just sort of stimulating, what do you call it, independent filmmaking and stuff in general. And then naturally out of that, we'll find things that contain the types of narratives we want.
Yeah, that's probably true. And of course, there's mountains of literature, from the past, I don't know, all of human history, and most of it, pushes reactionary messages in one sense or another, because everything before the 1960s is reactionary, more or less. Even just,
I think.
Even things that at one time would have been considered to have progressive messages can have things that are interesting in them. Go ahead, reaction.
Sorry, there is a bit of a delay. That might have been the problem, but I actually think that this does tie into libertarians and why it might be a good idea to go post-libertarian, because often libertarians are atheists, or they deny the metaphysical world, or they just deny the transcendental. And that ties into art itself. You know, as someone sympathetic to high Tory exaltation of high culture, if you don't believe in the transcendental, then you don't you aren't really committed to an objective idea of beauty. And I think that's the problem with the libertarian is I've never seen good art from them. I've never seen any high culture from them. So when you expose people that don't even have that kind of understanding, or that their mind is not even that kind of realm, when you show them that kind of high culture, it might speak to the heart of every man.
Good point. And high culture is critical to any movement that's going to be elite driven, which I think is how we want ours to be.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And one more super chat for now, at least. Son of Tiamat says, even the term classical liberal has been subverted. I've heard center-left types like the former skeptics call themselves that. I think that's true, but I think that was a relatively brief internet phenomena. I mean, I know like Sargon back when he was a center-left called himself a classical liberal. But I don't know, I can't really think of that many people anymore that wouldn't more or less validly be considered a classical liberal that call themselves that. I think that was a relatively brief, like 2015 internet phenomena.
Yeah, I don't think that term has been subverted in the general culture like the concept of libertarianism is.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not any type of liberal, so it, yeah, I'm not any type of liberal, so it's not like I have a great need to defend any of these terms, or try and reclaim them. But I do think it's a relatively useful term for a certain type of belief, and I don't think it has too negative a connotation or it's been subverted too much. I mean, everything's been subverted at least a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
His question about the subversion actually reminds me of the video made Settler where Vosh was debating Sargon and using classical liberal, or just the idea of liberalism, as an Overton window trap. And I think that's what he might be meaning about the subversion, where the classical liberals, like John Stuart Mill, would never accept the hedonism and materialism and just tolerance of everything that we have today. So I just find it interesting that lots of big brain enlightened centrists decide to go with the principle now.
Yes, that is actually fair. I suppose classical liberalism itself can be can be used as a subversion. And there's a lot of things in it which can be used to drag people to the left. Even I remember when I was researching some of this stuff, like old liberal views of borders and immigration and stuff. There was some stuff in the surface level research I did. There was some stuff that Locke wrote that could possibly be considered. Advocating what we would now call open borders, though the issue is there's no way he possibly would have understood it would have come anywhere close to what it has come to. But just the concept of liberalism and the dialectic that exists around it allows people to be dragged to the left. It allows it allows the mainstream institutions to sort of define what these specific words mean, when certain things are liberty and when certain things aren't liberty, in often arbitrary fashion, and that allows you to drag the conversation to the left. So I'd agree that's probably the most problematic way that the term is used.
Someone in chat reminded us. I actually encountered this term recently called super liberalism, which I think is kind of.
I've never heard that.
Kind of funny. So it's a reference to. You may or may not know this, but you can actually find this on Wikipedia. So when Julius Evola was on trial, he referred to himself as a super fascist in terms of being beyond fascism, and that's kind of where we are in this sort of semi-ironic sense. in this state of super liberalism, where we're just beyond liberalism, so liberal that we'll throw commies and other types of problematic people out of helicopters. So I think the term super liberal is actually kind of funny and potentially useful in this sort of tongue-in-cheek kind of way.
Maybe. I'm not. I mean, like I said, none of us here are really liberals, so.
No, I wouldn't use it, but it could be useful
yeah.
for some people to use if they want it.
Yeah. That's interesting. So that's all the super chats for now, at least. I don't know. I'm not really sure what else to discuss.
Well,
here.
Have you noticed the very well, like I said, I mentioned that most of them are atheists, so they don't really make arguments based in metaphysics. But you notice that a lot of them, and Razor Fist comes to mind, they have this very empirical rationalist streak to them. I really enjoyed the debate that Razor Fist had with E. Michael Jones on pornography, where lay rational Razor Fist is describing skeptically that he's not convinced. There's not enough studies to say that porn is an addiction, and E. Michael Jones is like this older guy saying, "Oh well, I see the millions of Google searches, so therefore, they have a problem missing out on classical wisdom and all those things that predicate the belief systems we have now." So they have a serious problem with that, in that they're able to be so skeptical and based in scientism, when classical wisdom and the assumptions we had brought them the scientism we have now.
Yeah, that's true. I mean that is one of the core critiques of the entire concept of liberalism. And yeah, that was Styx, not Razorfist. But
Oops,
yes,
my bad.
No problem. But yes, that's that is the one of the sort of core issues with liberalism. Is the fact that very, very often the greatest tyrant that someone experiences is the eternal tyrant. Is, as St. Augustine said, a man has as many masters as he has vices. If it's like you don't need any in-depth. You don't need any sort of in-depth studies to determine whether or not pornography is an addiction. Is there a massive amount of people who would maybe prefer not to look at pornography constantly, but they are? Yes, there's a significant amount of people that are in that position. That they would like to do something, but their willpower is not able to get them at that point. Okay, then they're that thing's slave. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter if that's food or if that's pornography, or if that's video game addiction. People are enslaved to these vices. And we can see that very demonstrably with how people relate to them currently.
I'm just amazed that Styx could poo-poo on E. Michael Jones, and I know people are commenting it was like blood sports. He wasn't really taking it seriously, but really though, that problem that he has implies that they don't have a comprehensive understanding of human nature. They think people can be autonomous, rational actors when they really aren't. There's much more that forms human than the logical mind, the higher mind that they have. So they miss out on empathy, on all these other facets of the human that really defines what they are, and not just the rationalism that Styx is talking about. Is AA saying Jones was low IQ in that very? Okay, sorry.
Pretty harsh.
I think he was Chad, actually.
I know. I don't really. I mean, I know I did a video on it, so I should remember it. But it was a while ago. So I don't remember the debate too well. But I do remember. My main takeaway that I remember, other than just Styx's scientism, is that they seemed to be talking past each other quite a bit.
Yeah, I agree with that from what I remember. I came up with a hot take on this problem we're discussing right now. So this relates sort of to like the the incel and OnlyFans problem. I think, and just the pornography problem generally. I think, and this is just a hot take, so don't take this too seriously. I think if you legalized brothels, the OnlyFans problem would basically disappear overnight. And I think this would be a much preferable state of affairs as a stopgap to solving this problem than what we have now. What do you think of that?
Well, it goes in line with them. Oh, sorry, you go, Seller.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm not totally sure about that. I mean, just in a moral sense, I don't think there's much of a difference between the two interactions. But
consider that these have existed for most of human history, right?
Yeah, there is at least a much more natural sort of sorting mechanism with brothels, where like the amount of where like a woman on OnlyFans can have like hundreds of thousands of betas following her.
Yeah,
where, like,
I think that's more degenerate. I think it's more degenerate.
No, exactly. I am agreeing. Where it's the like ratio would be much lower with like going to your local brothel. I mean, I'd prefer just neither, to be honest. Though, I do believe St. Augustine, I was just, mentioning, did support legalizing brothels. I've never read that part of his work, so I'm not sure what exactly his argument for that was, but in some sort of general harm reduction concept. So I don't know, that there could be a... there could be some sort of benefit to that. But with that said, I do believe there are a fair number of places in the West today where prostitution is more or less legal. And I know, I mean, I imagine stuff like OnlyFans is probably less common there. But I doubt it's like unheard of. It's probably still really common. I mean, I think one of the main attractions to that type of stuff is that it gives you a certain sense of intimacy and a certain sense of connection. But it doesn't require any of the risk that something like a brothel would require. It doesn't require actually going out there. You're able to just do all this in the privacy of your own home, and you're able to do it without taking any sorts of risks. Or even just like going to a brothel is something that could like get you in trouble socially. That could be embarrassing. Is something that you would have, and every single time you needed to go there, there'd be some degree of difficulty. But yeah, so yes, there are certain natural things in brothels that makes at least certain aspects of it less objectionable. But my ideal outcome would definitely be to just ban it all.
I enjoy the pragmatic politicking, these kinds of strategies, where technically... Oh, sorry, you want to go?
I was laughing.
Where technically, we would be against brothels, but what we need to understand, and I think what libertarians need to understand, because they're so often purists in this respect, is that sometimes reaching the location or the ideology that you want a society to adopt isn't a straight line. So in fact, something as interesting as imposing martial law on the sections of the country that are rioting in the US, that would be getting closer to libertarianism, because it's restoring order, and order is a necessity and a predicate for. And I also noticed that someone's commenting here, "You religious types ruin the right, so stop talking BS. You all end up as the ultimate ideologues in the end." I just enjoy how
based.
Yeah. Thanks for the compliment.
being ideologue is like being an ideologue is an epithet now. I think what he's really talking about is the religious right is the only ones fighting for imposing social standards from above, imposing normalizing ways to act in the public sphere, and the most intimate actions you do. So I think this is an example of the antipathy towards any kinds of social standards that some lowberts have. And MH, it's really good to have a paternal force. You need a paternal force in society, and you need a paternal force in your life.
Yeah,
well
no,
said.
that's a pretty epic comment. Do you have anything else to say, Charlemagne?
No, I think 21st Reaction covered it pretty well there.
Okay. We have a few more super chats. One says, and I'm not Greek. Same person as before, I think. He just changed his name to more Greek. £5 for the brothel solution. You're damn right. So that's pretty simple. And Patrick for $10 says, Bubba Wallace, 1/4 black, did a race hoax with NASCAR, and they got 100% behind him. Giant march of all the racing crews. It turned out that that the thing was a garbage door pulled down. Attempt at cultural revolution in conservative sports. I don't know if I vaguely heard about that story. I don't know if the summary of that there is true or not. I'm not saying that you're lying. I'm just I need to look into it to know whether or not that is accurate or not. But we certainly see many of these hoaxes. MAGA country and all. So it would not at all surprise me if it ended up being a hoax. But
yeah, it was a hoax. I saw that followed up on by today. I think the FBI were even involved in the investigation, which is kind of ridiculous. But there was something that was shaped like a noose, and it turns out the rope was always shaped like that on the garage door, and just for convenience, and it had nothing to do with lynching people.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's just incentives, as libertarians always talk about. The incentives of the current system is that you can gain a lot from these sorts of things, and you often can lose very little. So it just it makes sense to do these sorts of things. You can get tons of fame. You can get a lot of attention. You can make money off of it, and the chances that you'll have negative repercussions are very small. I mean, you had another situation I know slightly more about was Oakland, I think, where there were some ropes in a tree, and they obviously were not anything nefarious, but there was this massive public freakout about it, and they were saying that they were nooses, even though they obviously were just like circular ropes in a tree. And then a black guy came out and said that they were his, that he set it up for a swing or something like that, for children to play on. And that's been there for like a year. And then like they still kept on freaking out and said, and said that we need to investigate this even after a black guy said that he was the one that did and it was nothing nefarious. So it's just, I don't know. These are just things we need to get used to. There's lots of things that we just need to get used to on the right, and we need to understand this will just keep on happening. And we need to push back about it. We need to point out the contradictions, all that type of stuff. We need to point out when it's wrong, so people can lose a bit more faith in the mainstream media when they push these obviously ridiculous narratives. But at the end of the day, you need to understand these obviously false narratives are going to continue to be pushed, and you need to not allow that to like harm your mental health too much. You need to just not get upset by this stuff too much. It's just going to continue happening, and we're not going to stop it anytime soon. And as long as the progressives control the entirety of the media, except for a couple outfits, they're going to push these same stories. And we just need to learn to live with it at the end of the day.
Yeah, well said. And I mean, there's nothing they can do. There's no amount of statues that they can push over that can't be put back. There's no amount of historical records they can attempt and actually get rid of Western man, because we're always going to be here no matter how much destruction they they try to wreak. Like, they cannot get rid of us. You cannot push us over. We're going to have to suffer through. No one likes to see the statues and all this other culture destroyed, but no matter what, we're going to make it through in the end. And if we have to deal with a few slings and arrows along the way, that's just something we deal with. It's not going to break us. They can't break us by knocking over inanimate objects, no matter how precious they might be.
Yeah.
oops, sorry. Did you guys see the story that came out today, I think, or yesterday, about a homosexual man named he was a BLM radical named Carlos Dillard, and he was basically accosting this lady that might have cut him off in traffic, and just starts making claims about her being saying racially offensive things and all that. And he immediately goes to just showing her license plate and her place, just basically doxing her right there. And what makes this story unique is that the lady is responding in hysterics. She's in absolute histrionics because she knows that the eye of Sauron is coming onto her. So we need to understand that the people on the ground will believe, no matter what they say, they will believe this narrative. And there are some of these people in these peripheral racial groups that actually do have seething hatred, and you need to respond accordingly to that, because if you ever get in their way, they are willing to lie and to do some extremely dangerous things to normal people. So I think we have to be aware of that and make sure we act accordingly and stay as safe as possible. Try and not have your power levels too high when you go around.
Yeah, it you do need to know, like, you know, when is useful to talk about these types of things. Like, you know, what's you know, like what's the point in letting all your, like, everyone at university know that you're conservative or whatever. Like, I'm not saying you shouldn't expose some people that you think might be sympathetic. But, like, are you really going to achieve anything by trying to have a debate on gay marriage in your university class, or are you just going to get blackballed? Probably the latter. And it is important to expose these ideas sometimes, but you don't. There's no reason to obsess over them in areas where you know you're just going to, you know, there's no positive and quite a bit of possible negative. Did you have something to say?
Yeah, you know, there you kind of do want to be at max power level all the time, but you really have to be careful, because there isn't really much room for mistake on the right wing. If you make one really bad mistake, that can hurt you for a really long time. So yeah, like you said, there's really no point in getting into these debates that sort of reveal you to these average people who at the end of the day are just some people who might not even end up voting or really doing anything. And it's not worth it to risk potential growth in just, you know, where you're going in your life by doing that. You know, it's kind of just a scorched earth policy that we can't enact right now. So I think if you can bring your power level up with someone, you ought to, but only if it's very tactically viable for you at that moment. Just be really careful.
Yeah. It is definitely important to share these things. Just make sure it's done in safe positions. Just, you know, with people where distant ideas aren't going to get you, like, totally tarred and feathered. Which, you know, it shouldn't be too difficult to figure out where those places are. But yeah, so it's just you need to be careful with how you do these things. But moving on, another super chat. Thanks again, everyone, for all the super chats. Colin for $5 said, "How do you sell? How would you sell the cultural axioms to young minds? Use their heroic memes against them? Be iconoclasts to liberal sacred cows, and be cavalier."
Is that a suggestion?
I think so.
Let's
I mean,
see.
I do. I mean, I think it's just grotesque, like the statue smashing, that type of stuff. So I am not, like, I don't think that's what he's you know, suggesting. But you know, I do think the sort of intellectual iconoclasm, sort of trying to tear down left-wing figures and left-wing concepts, is useful and something that you need to do to sort of expose false narratives. That's my that's like my goal with the Churchill video I did on the Bengal famine. The point isn't even really that specific narrative. The point is to point out how much false information can circulate about things like that, and to make you really mistrust academia, because we know that they put out false things. We know they put out misleading things a lot. So I mean, again, I think that is a pretty good example where basically the entirety of the narrative that you'll see about the Bengal famine is all based on one study by one economist, and the entire study is massively flawed. So when you realize that that such massive flaws can seep in from just one person doing one bad study, that's something that I think is really useful and can make people realize that how deep the flaws are. That we really need to be careful when believing these things. So sort of like pointing out the flaws to sort of deepen the issues people have with these institutions, I think can be useful.
Yeah, and sometimes you don't even have to employ active iconoclasm so much as just to not care about, whatever social justice thing they're going to bring up. Like if it has to do with the 19th Amendment or whatever, you could just, not care. I don't care about your opinions on that, right? And you can just leave it at that, basically.
Reaction. Do you have anything to say?
I noticed
another response that is really emblematic of the
libertarian mind. The same person said, "I tolerate religion, but it's not a practical thing. Sorry." So this is exactly one of the problems libertarians have, in that, some of the big brains, some of the more perceptive ones, understand why it would be better to live in a community around religious conservatives like Dave Smith or Stefan Molyneux. They can come to the traditionalism that comes from a religion in a kind of pragmatic, utilitarian manner. But since they don't have a sincere, intentional belief in it, and it's just based in pragmatism, the problem is they cannot determine whether behaviors like choosing low time preference, deferring gratification for long-term fulfillment in your life, you cannot determine and describe how that is morally better than being high time preference and pleasuring yourself in the current moment. So they basically set themselves up in moral pragmatism. And when you don't have that fundamental just dogmatic belief, it just doesn't work. You cannot come to sincere morality from a practical perspective.
Yeah, and this is one of the reasons why the only alternative path that I actually respect is basically the Nietzschean one. I think it's the only logical conclusion to that atheistic mindset, because when you try to find this middle ground position where you build up this pragmatic moral framework that ultimately stands on nothing, you're kind of just you're just on a foundation of sand here. I mean, there's nothing really underpinning anything you believe, and you might as well just go, full master morality with it. So I actually do, although I don't agree with the moral conclusions, I guess I intellectually respect the people who actually go all the way with their, I guess, moral nihilism, because logically you can't, to me, I can't figure out any other place you can end up but in that position if you don't adopt the Christian or other metaphysical paradigm.
I agree. There's like, and I banned him, by the way, but screw nerds. But I really hate this mentality of like, oh, if you ban your enemies, they win. If you come in here and if you be annoying, I'm going to ban you. Okay, like I'm happy to do it. I've done it before. I'll do it again. Sorry, Justin Trudeau. But yeah. No, I agree, because I mean I do have a certain sympathy to like the Stefan Molyneux approach of like Christianity is really cool and based and does a lot of good things for society, but it's wrong. I enjoy that he's like nice to Christians, I guess. But like the logical endpoint of that is like, I don't know, it's just a complete collapse. Like, what are you doing? There's no like, how could you possibly sustain a society like that? If that's the conclusion everyone came to, that like religion's wrong but it's useful, the conclusion is eventually going to be that it will go away. So yeah, it just there's no that I mean that's a logical position for like a couple people in society to hold, but there's no way you can actually build a society like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't know. Does anyone else have anything to say or talk about?
I think we've covered the original question fairly well at this point, and addressed a few other interesting things with the super chats.
Yeah, I think most of the super chats were pretty interesting. And thank you, of course, for the money, guys. 21, is there anything you have to say?
Oh, I'm sorry. It's really the delay. But I was just thinking, there's that one last possibility. The dog pile on Endeavor and what was it, AA stream about pornography. I think that was an interesting event that's emblematic of the folly of the libertarians, and that they always pay attention and put down the conservatives when they impose social standards, but they do nothing to fight the Cultural Revolution.
Yeah, I agree. This is actually one of the biggest problems with libertarianism. Something that is actually this is actually worth a bit of it is something that's worth quite a bit. It is something that's worth to discuss. It is, again, as the libertarian ideology is sold to us, in like the intellectual sense, they say that that it's about the abstract notion that people do not have the right to impose their force against other people, which makes sense, is a relatively consistent moral position to hold. But the issue, the issue with that is that's never how it really turns out, as we can see with that stream. They say that, oh, it's just about these abstract moral values, but then if you try and take people's pornography away, then they like freak out. Oh my God, you're an authoritarian, and it's not based on an abstract moral position that they're holding. It's based on a particular attachment to these particular things. And even, I'm not saying like every person there is an addict. But the issue is like, why is that the one thing you can't ban? There's so many things that are banned constantly. We're not in the libertarian state. We're not anywhere close to that. But this one thing that all the mainstream institutions pump through our mind is important and cannot possibly be banned. Is the one thing that all these classical liberals jump to the defense of and say you could possibly question this. And even worse, I mean, I remember when I used to follow libertarian publications and stuff. The argument that you would expect if they actually really believed the line that the abstract notion of liberty is what matters and the particular problems do not justify government intervention. What you'd expect for the libertarian answer to any possible social problem is whatever you do, just don't get the government involved. But the answer I saw very frequently from them, even from like mainstream supposedly like reasonable libertarian outfits, was not just saying that, oh, liberty, so you shouldn't get involved with this. It's the thing that I very frequently saw from libertarian outfits was that they would deny that these things are problems altogether. So, for example, like pornography. They will say that like, oh, it's just about liberty, but then when you start questioning it, they say, oh no, there's nothing wrong with it at all. It's totally cool. There's no problems with it. It's not causing any social problems, and that shouldn't be the libertarian answer. The libertarian answer should be, yeah, there's problems with it, but don't ban it. Find other ways to deal with it. And I still think that conclusion's wrong, but that would at least be a reasonable conclusion. But where it always seems to go with libertarians is that no, none of these social problems are actually social problems at all. There's no problem with tons of people doing cocaine. There's no problem with fentanyl. There's no problem with there's no problem with pornography. There's no problem with video game addiction. There's no problem with obesity. Just leave it up to the market to decide. Not like we need to find different solutions to these problems. It's very rare that they actually talk about what these different solutions are. They usually just deny that these are problems altogether.
And if you do recognize the problem, you have to be willing to use force to solve certain endemic problems, especially when the enemy is willing to use force against you, like we're seeing now. I mean, effectively, what the left has done right now in America in particular is just deploy a private army to enact out their will by force. And if you're not willing to oppose that with, a counterweight of force, meet them in the field. I'm not saying like go out and actually fight people, but conceptually, you have to be willing to use power against power, or you're just going to lose every single time. And the problem with libertarians sometimes recognizing, like the pornography problem and the drug problem is the whole, concept of it not directly aggressing on anyone, but the damage it does to the social fabric sort of necessitates some mechanism to deal with that. And ideally, it's going to be a purely social mechanism. But if it comes down to the state having to actually intervene, then so be it, basically. Like some problems just need to be solved one way or the other. Like just like the current problem with the riots and Chaz and all of this. I mean, there'd be absolutely nothing wrong with the state intervening and just putting an end to these problems. And you have to be willing to do that, even in certain situations where, it's not some sort of direct confrontation, or else you're never going to undo what's been done.
Oh yeah, I mean, preventing just rampant property destruction and violence in the streets is literally the most basic thing that we should expect from the government. I mean, there's only a few more things that are more basic than that. So the government it is just failing in its most basic duties, and I do think that is an important point to make. None of us believe, now that none of us are any types of liberals, that doesn't mean any of us think that everything needs a government solution. Just that government solutions are very useful in many different places.
Yeah, and the answer to the pornography problems is really easy. Just ban the production of pornography, and that's it. And you'll axe 90% of the problem at least. All of these big production companies that are making all this stuff, they'll go away instantly, and you cut off the vast majority of the problem right there. Especially in terms of as we know, these industries are very abusive to the people in them. This stuff you can just quash it. You don't have to go around in everyone's house arresting them when they're watching porn. That's obviously an extreme. It's not even possible to do that, right? But you can just ban the production of it, and that's it. That's like executive order territory, right? Practically, where you just sign a piece of paper, and now it's illegal for these companies to produce it, and it would be very easy to prosecute them because they're these massive incorporated entities. So you don't need some complex solution here.
Yeah, I mean, there still would be other issues and difficulties. But it's, as I said, like several months ago now in the prohibition video I made about American prohibition and pornography, it's just a fact that almost always banning things reduces consumption. There are outliers, but those are outliers. In most cases, prohibition is pretty effective at reducing the overall access to whatever you're trying to prohibit. And American prohibition is such a great example of this because, like we were talking about deconstructing leftist lies, it's just wrong. The idea that prohibition had no effect on consumption at all. That's just blatantly incorrect. According to libertarians themselves, is the main study I cited in that video was two libertarian professors who were very anti-drug prohibition. According to them, there was at a minimum a 30% decrease in alcohol consumption during prohibition. And it's possibly higher according to some other stuff, or even according to their own. They had a range, but 30% is the lowest number that they gave. So yes, it's just like if we were just to ban this stuff, consumption and access would just become more difficult. That doesn't mean that it reach zero, but it never reaches. But none of these problems ever reach zero. So it's that's just a ridiculous standard to set. The question is, can we achieve a better outcome by implementing certain means? And these are means that you probably could. It's as someone said in the chat earlier. We know this works because this works with child content. I don't want to say that phrase in case it gets us automatically banned, but you know what I'm talking about. I remember from a young age, I saw regular pornography on the internet all the time, but I never saw the underage variety of that ever. I never have at all. I'll see pornography without trying, even to this day. And when I was a child, I saw adult pornography without even trying. But I've never come across the illegal forms because it's illegal, because it's hard to find, because it's illegal. So we know right now that banning it would make it more difficult. But yeah, so that
very salient point.
Yeah, so
this is.
Go ahead.
This is what really crosses a line for me. Sorry, this is really what crosses a line for me is when libertarians, the high-minded classical liberal, is ambivalent to this issue. If we know that the majority of young boys averaging age 10 to 12, that's the first time they get exposed to pornography. The majority of people under 18 are exposed to pornography that has sexually deviant acts in it. They need to understand that being ambivalent to this issue means that you are being ambivalent to the steady sexualization of children. And this doesn't go down a good road, folks. It's not a joke. This does not lead to voluntary marriage contracts in the future or whatever. Marriage is out of the legal framework. This leads to the extreme sexualization of children in reality. So, forgive me for being frustrated with them, with all this poo-pooing over, you guys can't ban anything. I just wish they would provide a solution to the problems they have instead of always avoiding and crapping on other people's solutions.
Yeah, and it really is kind of amazing how easy it is to just come into contact with pornography now. I mean, I don't remember what it was, but I was searching on DuckDuckGo a few days ago, or a few weeks ago rather, for just something that wasn't even an explicitly pornographic term. But when you don't have the filters on from Google and stuff, certain keywords will just bring up nothing but pornography links, and I'm just like, what's going on here? You can just walk into this stuff completely accidentally, right? That just can't happen to children, right? This is something we cannot have happening in society on a regular basis.
Yeah, it does. This is just the status quo. And there is no there's no get the government out of it solution to this.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that we have the New Deal consensus, we have just all this coercion, every facet of life. Increasing taxes, the government spending per GDP ratio is 30% in the US or something like that. It's 50% in some European countries. You can't even go outside right now, but you have the freedom to be a slave and to watch disgusting things on the internet. You need to really think about that. People need to stop complaining about, oh, don't ban things, I'm scared. They need to stop complaining and get off of CSGO and go out in the world and talk to people sincerely, talk to people about issues of trauma and being exposed to this kind of stuff. Instead of, sitting in a room complaining about us who want to try and do something in the material world. Sorry, it just gets to me, this specific issue, because they're taking the souls of these young children. It's literally satanic idea ever. Like David Marmerstein, the people that own the giant media empires that these things are. It's bigger than the sports industry. And they built all their wealth and all their mansions off the backs of children's souls. So it's basically the most detestable thing. And really, the ambivalence from certain libertarians like Styx shows a kind of callousness.
Mm-hmm.
I think here's a good place to end the stream. But thank you everyone very much for watching, and thank you especially for the super chats. Make sure to subscribe to everyone here, especially 21stReaction, since he's new and doesn't have a great deal of subscribers. He's made a couple of videos so far, and they're pretty interesting. So I'd highly recommend checking it out. Remember to follow me on Twitter, donate to my Subscribe Star, and I'll probably be hanging out in Discord after if you want to chat. So feel free to pop in there too. And thanks, Charlemagne and 21stReaction for joining me today.
It was an honor.
Yep.
Yeah. Bye.